Welcome to Channel 17, the Town of Colonie Government Channel.
All right, well, welcome. Thanks for coming. This is our second event for our month-long, I guess you could say, celebration of this book, The Great Divorce. Star was just telling me that Ilian's a great speaker, so make sure you come for her. She's going to be here on November 6th on a Sunday. There's flyers in the back. There's also a lot of information about the Shaker Heritage Society and all their events, particularly the Christmas craft fair is a biggie over there. So Star is the executive director over there, and she's going to tell us about the Shakers and the role of women, because I know, as you know in the book, one of her biggest battles was against the Shakers, besides the laws at the time. So here's Star D'Angelo to tell us about the Shakers.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for coming out today for my talk. I always like to start by getting a sense of how much you all know about the Shakers. So how many of you feel like you're very, very familiar with Shaker history? Raise your hand. Just a couple of you. Okay, we will start with just a little bit of an overview of the Shakers, and then I'll talk a bit about some specific Shaker women that will give you some insights into their role within the Shaker community. And throughout the time, please feel free to raise your hand, ask questions. I really like to interact and be talking to you and having a dialogue with you, so please don't be shy. Ask any and every question you might have, because I think that works a lot better. So the Shakers were a communal religious society that actually did not start in America. It started in Manchester, England. And Manchester was the first industrial city in the world. And so the people who started the Shaker movement were what we would consider blue-collar workers, basically. They were people who were working in the textile mills. They were blacksmiths. They were everyday people. They were not wealthy people. They were disenchanted with the churches that existed at that time. Two of them, James and Jane Wardley, really were the starters of the movement, and they had been Quakers at one point, and they had fallen out of that faith because they were very interested in celibacy, and they were interested in living together in a communal setting. So the Quakers didn't provide that for them. So some people think that the Shakers, they get the Shakers and the Quakers confused, and there are some similarities, primarily in that they believed in pacifism and in confession of sin. And there are, they're certainly sister religions, but Shakerism is quite different in that they came up with a completely different concept of what a family is. But that was not in place in the mid-1700s in Manchester, England, yet. They just had this kind of nebulous idea about pacifism and living together in harmony and creating this utopian religious society. And out of this group of people came a young woman named Annalee. She ultimately brought the Shakers to the New World. She had a vision that told her to come to the New World and establish this utopian society. So she, in effect, became the founder of the movement in America, but she certainly wasn't the first. In fact, she was relying heavily upon Jane Wardley as a mother figure. Annalee had lost her mother fairly young, and so Jane Wardley, I think, kind of stepped in and filled that role for her. And she encouraged Annalee to explore her own spirituality. According to oral histories, Annalee she was given to having visions and interested in spirituality from a very young age. We don't know if this is exactly true. She was illiterate. We don't have anything written in her lifetime really about her, other than some letters and other accounts of worship services that she participated in. We don't even have a lot of material culture associated with her. I've tried to track down all the artifacts associated with her, and I could only find 3 items that might possibly have actually belonged to her. And ironically, they were all fragments of aprons, which are kind of associated with motherhood and the maternal. She was a mother, in fact. She had 4 children. She was forced into a marriage she didn't want, and she subsequently had 4 children, all of whom died before the age of 6. And I think this had something to do with the escalation of her interest in spirituality. I think that in her grief, she was seeking solutions. And out of that came this idea of bringing her group to the New World. So in 1774, they boarded a ship called the Maria. It was actually a condemned boat, and just miraculously came into Manhattan Harbor. Just like so many other immigrants, they came into New York City, and they disappeared, really, for about 2 years. We're not quite sure exactly what happened to them. They were working, they were raising money, these were poor people. Eventually, they were able to lease some property from the Van Rensselaers in this area, in what is now the town of Colonie. It was 7 miles west of Albany. It was undesirable swampland, and it was all they could get their hands on. So they managed to make their way up here, and they fled Manhattan just before George Washington was driven out by the British. And they themselves, being British, were accused of being spies. So in England, Annalee was given to preaching on street corners. We know she was arrested several times for speaking out in public. It was not acceptable. And the same kind of thing happened here in the New World. She was arrested on suspicion of being a British spy, thrown into jail, and ultimately released.
I have a question. Was she, were English women allowed to speak in public at that time?
They were not allowed to preach on street corners, and that's what she was doing. And there are, as I was saying, we don't have a lot of hard evidence about Annalee, but we do have arrest records. We do know that she actually was arrested for disrupting church services, going into churches, Anglican churches, and telling them they weren't true Christians because they would bear arms and they would fornicate. So she was going into churches, she was preaching on street corners, she was doing all kinds of things that women were not supposed to do. And she was arrested more than once for doing that. She also was thrown into a mental institution at one point because they thought she was insane. In the New World, as I was saying, she was accused of being a British spy. And she actually was released by Governor Clinton. He intervened on her behalf. And that actually, I think, was the first instance of the Shakers being very sophisticated in lobbying government officials for their own cause. And they became quite good at that, as the Great Divorce actually shows many instances of that happening. Annalee also, after she had established the community here in Colonie, which throughout most of the time that the Shakers were here was called Watervliet, which is why it's called the Watervliet Shaker community by most scholars. I know it's confusing. When the Shakers first came here, it was Niskayuna, then it became Watervliet, now it's the town of Colonie. So we'll just call it the Albany Shaker community. It's a little bit less confusing. But in any case, they were able to establish themselves fairly quickly. These were people who were really used to hard work, and they set their hands to work, as they would say, right away, and began establishing their community. And in 1780, there was an incident called the Dark Day. It was a day when they may have been burning fields throughout New England, but for whatever reason, there was smoke that blotted out the sun. And this was a time of great economic insecurity and war. So people saw this as a sign from God that they should be more spiritual. So Annalee seized the opportunity, and she went on a missionary journey throughout the Northeast. And where she found enclaves of people who were sympathetic to her ideas about celibacy and pacifism and following the example of Jesus Christ, she established communities. So she planted the seeds for what eventually became the Shaker communities. So when you look at Annalee and you try to find hard evidence of what kind of person she was, you're really not going to find the hard evidence. You have to rely upon a grouping of oral histories that were collected long after she died. She passed away here in 1784. The first oral histories were collected in 1816. from the people who knew her, who actually spent time with her. So you have to take it with a grain of salt, because a lot of time had passed. They said, there were divine revelations, or they were miraculously able to remember every minute detail of everything that she said after all these years had passed. So there's some truth and some fallacy, I think, in those testimonials. But when you read them and you read between the lines, I think that you can see that she was, first of all, a woman who was incredibly courageous. I mean, we know for sure that she was doing things that women were not supposed to do, speaking out in public and preaching about religion. And also, if you read the accounts, with one person, she would take them by the arm and gently say, you should come and follow us because we have the true lifestyle, we are the true believers, and this is the best place for you to be. With another person, she'd be all fire and hell and brimstone. So I think she had a good understanding of human character as well, human nature, and was able to manipulate people, if you will, to follow her quite creatively. I think the courage and the bravery is what stands out most for me when I look at Annalee as a person. We know there are several accounts of her being inspected to see if she actually, in fact, was a woman. I know in in one case in Asheville, Massachusetts, she was actually taken into a tavern by a mob, and two women were assigned to take her up to a room and pull up her skirts and inspect her to see if in fact she was female. And they were doing this because she was doing things that were just not typical of female behavior. It certainly wasn't acceptable behavior. So I know of at least 3 different accounts of this happening where she was inspected in this manner. She also was regularly beaten, as were her other followers, by mobs. Some people liked the Shakers. In Ashfield, they liked the Shakers because they were an economic asset to the community. The Harvard, Massachusetts people didn't see it that way. So there were people in these various communities who would be in conflict also. So the Shakers were certainly a divisive presence in this area in the late 18th century. I'm going to move on to Mother Lucy Wright, who was the next very powerful female leader in the Shaker movement. So during Annalee's time period, the Shaker movement really was a kind of frenzied, ecstatic kind of spiritual movement. People were spinning around and falling to the floor. They were experiencing spirit possession types of experiences. They were crawling around on the floor and barking like dogs. This was not just the Shakers. There were a lot of other spiritual movements where this kind of phenomena also was occurring. After she passed away, the Shakers transformed more into what we think of as the Shakers today. So she planted the seeds, but she isn't the person who actually created the communities as we know them today. We can credit her successors for that. And the one thing she did that was quite brilliant before she passed away was she assigned a successor. And in many cases throughout the 18th century, there were a lot of new religious movements being established, a lot of charismatic spiritual leaders who were gathering together people to follow them. In most cases, once that charismatic leader passed away, that was the end of the movement. Not so for the Shakers, because Annalee assigned a man named James Whitaker to succeed her. He only lived for 3 years, and he appointed James Meacham to succeed him. And Meacham was a New Light Baptist minister from New Lebanon. He was quite intelligent, and he immediately assigned a counterpart to lead the Shaker movement, and that was Mother Lucy Wright. And he was the first to create this idea of dual power within the communities. Now, the Shakers believed that the Godhead was both male and female in character. So this reflected their belief that God shared both of those genders within that entity. And it also was translated throughout a system of hierarchical leadership that Meacham developed, and it's quite complex. Every Shaker community had pairs of men and women in charge of the entire community. Every family grouping had pairs of men and women in charge at the family level, and there were pairs of men and women in charge of the entirety of all of the Shaker communities. So I won't go into all of the details, but it was a very complex system of authority that he developed. Lucy Wright was born in 1760. And unlike Annalee, she was literate, she was quite intelligent, and she was from the upper classes. All accounts say that she was an incredibly beautiful woman. And she also had married somebody named Eliza Goodrich, and they had a true loving relationship. And they were exposed to the Shakers in New Lebanon, and Eliza was very intrigued by them and was interested in joining the movement, which would of course mean that their relationship had to dissolve because they were a celibate movement. Lucy Wright didn't initially like this idea. She was happy with her life and wanted to stay with her husband. But ultimately, they chose to join together. And it was a great sacrifice. They abandoned their love for each other. They abandoned the idea of having a family together and instead joined this other new kind of family, which consisted of 100 people or more living and working together in harmony in this religious movement. So when Joseph Meacham appointed they referred to her as Mother Lucy Wright, as the leader, it really took a lot of the men who were living as Shakers off guard. And they weren't exactly happy about it. I've read a number of references to not wanting to submit to this petticoat government that Lucy Wright was in charge of. And it became even worse after Joseph Meacham passed away. And in fact, Lucy Wright became the sole leader of the Shaker faith for quite a while. And you really can think of her as being one of the most powerful women in America. She was in charge of, at this, by the 1790s and 1800, there were 10 Shaker communities, and she was in fact in charge of all the people who lived in those communities, which was quite unusual level of power for that time period. She constantly had to battle, though, against the Shaker men who did not like the situation of having to report to a woman. So, I think in some ways, if you go to a Shaker museum and you talk about Lucy Wright, we like to tell you that men and women shared power equally in the communities. And in fact, they did to a larger degree, certainly, than in the outside world. Women who were assigned to be trustees, to be in charge of businesses, they were in charge of spiritual matters. But still, they followed traditional gender lines when it came to the work that men and women did in the communities. And Mother Lucy herself had to continually fight off rebellions. There was a rebellion in 1790 where several young men left the Shaker community because they simply were not going to report to a woman. And when you read The Great Divorce, you also see that she had to continually put herself in the role of a woman. So she would say, there's a letter in here that Ilion has transcribed where she, I didn't mark the page, but basically she's saying, well, I'm just a woman and I don't have authority over this matter, but if I did, this is what I would say. So she was very mindful of the reality of her position, despite the fact that she had this surprising degree of power and authority for that time period. Mother Lucy Wright is significant in Shaker history, not only for being an early female leader, but also because she opened the ministry in the West. She was the one who said that we need to start, revive our evangelical efforts, and we need to go out west to Kentucky and Ohio and establish new communities. And that was quite significant. I'm not sure how extensive the Shaker faith would have spread without her pushing that effort. And it was quite a sacrifice to the communities in the Northeast because they had to assign leaders to go out on these missionary journeys, to go to the tent revivals in Kentucky and other areas, and to cultivate interest in the Shaker faith and ultimately to establish communities. And that also required sending people out to take care of administrative responsibilities, sending out money, supplies, goods, people who had expertise in areas of architecture and other things so that they could create these new communities. But ultimately, they were able to establish under her leadership over, it depends on how you want to count the communities and what you call a real established community and what isn't, but there were at least 19 communities that were established throughout the United States. So that's quite significant. That would not have happened if Mother Lucy had not pushed for that. She also regimented their worship. So she was the one who took them away from spinning around in circles and falling to the ground and having these ecstatic experiences to having a very regimented form of dance. And I don't know if you've ever seen it. If you've seen the Ken Burns documentary, you've probably seen it. But it consists of marching, in formation, sort of like this, bowing, reaching up for gifts, like this. And they actually have diagrams for the types of dances that they were doing as part of their worship service. And I think it was a way of imposing order on the community, not only on the worship, but also when you're used to practicing, they would practice these dances, then they would perform them for the public on Sundays, and it really, I think, reinforced the idea of uniformity and unity within the communities, which was quite significant. So she's probably, I think, more important than Annalee in many respects when it comes to the totality of Shaker history. And she's unfortunately a very overlooked figure in history. Ilian Wu does a really great job of outlining what her character was like as she battled with Eunice Chapman over the custody of Eunice's children. And we can talk about that a little bit later if you'd like. So any more questions?
Just a comment. About 20 years ago, they had a group from New Jersey that came to the Shaker buildings here and did the dance.
Yeah, there's controversy about that because I know the Shakers today are not so keen on that. And we've thought about it at the Shaker Heritage Society because we teach fourth graders a Shaker dance so that they can experience what the worship was like actually in the meeting house where the Shakers did it. I mean, we think it's really important, concrete connection to the past. The Shakers today don't like it, but I do know that Brother Ricardo Belden of the Mount Lebanon community was teaching teenagers the Shaker dance in the 1950s. So that's my rationale for going ahead and saying that we can do this. We are very respectful. It is a form of sacred worship, and we need to be mindful of that. So, we tell the children, this is not something you need to be cutting up over because this is actually a serious thing. It's not the way we worship today, but it was important to the Shakers in the past. So there are still a few people who do that. There is a scholar at Dartmouth College named Marianne Hagan who has taught herself the dances and occasionally will teach people the dance, but it's controversial. Okay, I'd like to move on to, I'm kind of moving ahead through time I'm going to jump ahead to Rebecca Jackson, who I think is a very interesting character. There have been a couple books written about her. I'm not sure if you have them in the library here, but she was an African-American woman who was born in Philadelphia. And she was born in Philadelphia in 1795, and she was born into a free black family. Her brother was a preacher in the African Methodist Episcopal Church. And she also, like Lucy Wright, married. But she was not really into her marriage at all. And she left her husband because she had a spiritual revelation that told her to do so. And like Annalee, apparently from her youth, she was given to receiving visions and having spiritual revelations. She also apparently, at least according to her accounts, had a divine gift given to her which allowed her to read and write. So we do have Rebecca Jackson's writings, and there's a book called Gifts of Power, which records all of her visionary writings. She had no children, and she decided to travel around and become a female preacher. So she traveled around with various groups throughout the Northeast and was preaching. And she joined a group called the Little Band that came to Albany. And that's how she became familiar with the Shakers. She came to Albany to preach with this group. And they were introduced to the Shakers. The Shakers were always open to talking to people of other faiths. They may not believe those other faiths, but they loved to talk about spirituality. And so they were always welcoming other groups. So she came here and was really intrigued by the Shakers, very interested in their faith, and felt that a lot of what they believed was in line with what she believed. So she joined the community. And she also saw herself as sort of a successor to Annalee. And perhaps she wanted to be maybe as powerful as Annalee was in the Shaker faith. It's hard to know for sure, but when I read about her, I get the sense that she wanted a greater degree of authority and power within the Shaker community than was acceptable at the time, whether it be for a woman or for a man. So she had this love-hate relationship, and she would leave and then come back, and then leave and then come back. And then ultimately, she decided to establish a community in Philadelphia, which she did. It was the only urban Shaker community. It functioned under the auspices of the South family here at the Albany Shaker community, and initially was not sanctioned by the Shakers. But Eldris Paulina Bates, who wrote an important theological text for the Shakers, gave her blessing to them. And so for the time period that this community functioned in is uncertain. There's very little research on this area, but we know it was a mixed race community. They were living in a brownstone in downtown Philadelphia. Half the group were African American women. There was a white woman who had been Jewish in the past, and there were a few white men. So this is quite astonishing. This would have been in the 1860s and 70s for a mixed race group to be living together and working together in Philadelphia. And Rebecca Jackson was most certainly the leader of that group. We also know that Rebecca Jackson was involved in helping the Albany Shakers shelter fugitive slaves and help them escape to freedom as well. Again, it's another area where we need to do a lot of research, but I want to point out that the Shakers, while things may not have been perfect, there are references to Eldris Paulina Bates going to see her beloved darkies in Philadelphia, and I'm not quite sure what to make of that reference or what the author might have been thinking about the black Shakers. Again, just as women were not treated purely as equals, African Americans certainly were not always accepted fully or treated as equals. But Rebecca Jackson shows that an African American woman, even an African American woman, could raise to a level of authority and power within the Shaker community and establish her own Shaker family in Philadelphia, which is quite significant. And she also was the person who was chosen to speak at Abraham Lincoln's memorial service in the 1848 Shaker Meeting House. So next time you're over there, you can walk out in the meeting house and you can imagine Rebecca Jackson there speaking about Abraham Lincoln. She was chosen because she was such an eloquent speaker. And because Abraham Lincoln was so important to the Shakers, they were quite distressed when he was killed. What's that?
What date did you just say about that? 1840?
I don't know that I...
Oh, I may have done something that wasn't there.
Yeah, I didn't write down the specific date of when that happened, but it's in the 1848 Shaker Meeting House.
Oh, okay.
That memorial service took place. So when you're there, you can imagine these events that occurred in the past. So one of them was Rebecca Jackson speaking out so eloquently. And there are long accounts of how eloquently she spoke about Abraham Lincoln and how important he was to the Shakers. So I think I point that out because it really indicates, I mean, this was an important role, and the Shakers felt perfectly comfortable having a woman fulfill that role. So they weren't perfect in terms of equality, but they certainly were far, far beyond what was acceptable in the outside world. Rebecca Jackson also had a very close friend named Rebecca Perot, and I think in Recapturing Wisdom's Valley, that book, there may be a photograph inaccurately labeled as being Rebecca Jackson. It's actually Rebecca Perot, who was her very dear friend. And after Rebecca Jackson passed away, Rebecca Perot took Rebecca Jackson's last name, which is very interesting. And I'm not quite sure what to make of that, but there's some potential for confusion there. I'm going to jump ahead to Emma Neal and Sadie Neal, and you can see their photos on the front of this book. And I want to highly recommend this book because this is a collection of primary source materials that are related to Shaker women. And you get some really important insights into the role of Shaker women in their society if you look at this book and read this. I'm not sure if you have it in your library, but if not, you should get a copy of it. This is Emma Neal here and her sister Sadie. They came to the Mount Lebanon Shaker community in New Lebanon, New York, when they were young girls. They were orphans, and the Shakers took in a lot of orphans. That was one way of increasing their numbers. And there's a wonderful account of them coming in by sleigh to the community, and they ended up being lifelong Shakers. They, like all Shaker women, rank and file women, did the work that women did. They took care of the men's clothes, they did the laundry, they did gardening, they did the cooking and cleaning, all of that stuff. But by the late 19th century, there were fewer and fewer men in the communities. So women started taking on positions of authority that they didn't previously hold, even within the Shaker community. So for example, Emma Neal took over the cloak industry. And they had these trustees or deacons that would be in charge of their various, literally hundreds and hundreds of business enterprises. Sometimes it would be women, but usually they weren't in charge of really important industries. So Emma G. Neal took over this cloak business, and she transformed it into a huge, huge moneymaker. In fact, the Emma J. Neal Cloak Company became wildly successful. And cloaks at the turn of the century, Shaker cloaks, were the thing to be wearing. Grover Cleveland's wife wore a Shaker cloak, an Emma J. Neal cloak, to his second inauguration. So she was, I think, a very important early businesswoman and quite successful. Her sister, Sadie, was a teacher here at Watervliet for many years. And because there was nobody to assign farm duties to, they decided to put her in charge of the farm business. So she was in charge of the apple orchards and all of that, and did quite well, considering that she had very few people to rely upon other than hired workers from the outside world. So she was a woman who was quite good at coordinating other people to get the work done and to keep the farm going. And you should know the Shakers were agrarian people. They bought in totally into Thomas Jefferson's agrarian ideal. They thought agriculture was a very pure and important kind of occupation. So for a woman to be put in charge of that, it was a very, very critical need for the community. Here at the Albany Shaker site, there was the 1916 barn that stands there today. There was a stone barn that stood there before then that was burned down in 1915 in an act of arson. And they rebuilt, even though the community closed down 10 years later, because agriculture was of such great significance to them that they felt they really had to do that. So it really does show the shift in the community in terms of the demographic, because they simply didn't have the men to be in charge of these things. But it also shows that there was a change in the outside world, I think, as far as what was acceptable and who would do business with whom. So they were changing as the outside world was changing as well. And ultimately, Emma J. Neal and Sadie Neal both died as Shakers. And I think what they left was a legacy of allowing the society to continue a few more years and to function in a solvent manner.
I don't know if you mentioned it, but the name of that book.
This is Mother's Firstborn Daughters, and it's by Jean M. Humez, Humez. I will say, we actually don't know a lot about the social history of the Shakers in many respects, because other than Jean Humez and a few other scholars, there's not been a lot of attention paid to women, first of all, and there's actually not been a lot of attention paid to social history in the Shaker faith. If you look on the bookshelf in the library, I'm sure you'll see, a dozen books about Shaker furniture and maybe one book about the people. So we are delighted to see that Ilian Wu has written this book, which is largely about women and their role in society. Eunice Chapman, who vehemently did not want to be a Shaker, fought as hard as she could, and is quite an admirable woman, I think, because of the battle she waged. She was one of the few women to successfully get her children back from the Shakers. So this book, I think, portrays the Shakers in a pretty fair light. The fact that they took Eunice's children and removed them out of state probably was not the right thing to do in many respects. But on the other hand, it's what they felt they had to do. It's what Lucy Wright felt she had to do. So I think if you really want to get great insights into the role of women in society, read this book, because I think this is where you're going to really get the most detail. Also, if you look at Jean Humez's book, you'll see actual primary source materials, letters, and other documents that are written about and by the women who lived in the communities. And it's a beginning point. I think we don't have a comprehensive understanding, actually, of the role of women in the community, and there's a lot more work to be done. So I encourage you strongly to come to the book discussions, to come and hear Ilian Wu speak. I met Ilian around the time she started doing the research on this book, and I know it was thoroughly researched. She's a great speaker, and you'll definitely enjoy that. I also encourage you to come to the Shaker Heritage Society's Christmas Craft Fair. It's our major source of revenue for the society. We are a tiny little nonprofit. We just this past year got a long-term lease from Albany County, which has owned the church family site since 1925. So for the first time ever, the society is eligible for grants to fix up the buildings, to start revitalizing the site. We have an award-winning site master plan. We do have a very clear vision for the future use of the site and management of the site. And we're also doing a lot of innovative programming. We do a lot of programming for senior citizens, for children, for people of all ages. And we will soon be launching a virtual reconstruction of the historic site, which will be available on our website. We hope within the next few weeks. We're a little bit behind schedule. You'll be able to see how the site changed in 4 different time periods through that project. So there are going to be 3D digital models of the buildings, and you'll be able to literally fly through the site in 1790, in 1825, in 1925, and see how it changed over time. We've lost a lot of the historic integrity of the Albany Shaker site, unfortunately, so this is our best way to show you how it's changed over time. And I strongly encourage you to continue to learn about the Shakers. They are truly a unique American phenomena and are a very important part of our heritage. So does anyone have any more questions for me?
What was the population of the Shakers?
Scholars vary in their estimates. The estimate that is cited most frequently is at their peak in about 1850, there were 6,000 Shakers nationwide. Within the last month or two, Hamilton College has set up a listserv for Shaker scholars to talk to each other. This has never happened before. We're actually all talking to each other and sharing information, and what we're discovering is we knew there's a revolving door in the communities. People were coming and staying for a while and going out into the world very frequently. We think that there were tens of thousands of people who lived as Shakers at one time or another. And so we're working right now to create a comprehensive list of names so that we'll have a better idea of actually how many people lived as Shakers in certain time periods. I think the 6,000 figure may be a little bit high for 1850, but over the course of time, it was many, many thousands of people who experimented with that lifestyle and that faith.
What were some of their beliefs and non-beliefs?
Well, they believed their theology basically was they were trying to emulate Jesus Christ. So they believed in pacifism, confession of sin, communal ownership of property, and they were celibate as well. They believed that God was both male and female in character, although it's essentially a Protestant faith. They did read out of the Bible.
Kind of a selfish question. I was trying to find Annalee's gravestone. It's really hard to read any of the stones except for the new ones. Do you know which one is hers?
Yeah, her gravestone is just slightly larger than the others. It's at the west end of the cemetery. We have a map at the meeting house if you need it. But if you go in the gate, it's almost directly across. Just look for the one that's slightly larger, and there's often coins and stones and stuff on her grave as well.
When we moved to this area in 1983, I got acquainted with the Shaker movement. I was told that there were only 3 practicing Shakers left, 3 ladies and me. And I was kind of surprised. You made reference to there are Shakers practicing today?
Yeah, right now there are 3. It fluctuates. You can still become a Shaker today if you want to. You have to try the life for a year. You have to be debt-free and give all your possessions to the church and conform to their lifestyle, which is a pretty big hurdle for most people. Brother Arnold is essentially their leader right now. He's probably in his mid to late 50s. A very intellectual and thoughtful person. Sister Frances Carr is the last one who was raised as a Shaker, and she's well into her 80s and not well. And she's the warmest, most wonderful person I've ever met. I mean, the first time I met her, she immediately threw her arms open and gave me the biggest hug I think I'd ever had. Just a really warm, wonderful person. And then there's Sister June, who's she's got to be getting close to 80 maybe. And is a very quiet person. Occasionally people try the life. I think the thing that drives them away is not the celibacy, not the culture of hard work that they have, but the stringent daily schedule. It's essentially a monastic kind of lifestyle. And if you go to their website, they have their daily schedule posted, at least last time I looked. And you wake up at 4 o'clock in the morning, you pray and you do your chores, and you pray and eat and do your chores, and that's pretty much what you do, unless there's a baseball game, and which Brother Arnold likes to watch now and then. So it's a very rigid kind of lifestyle.
There were also stories that these were hardworking, intelligent people. Did they invent the industry of commercial laundry machinery and some of those? There were also stories I'd heard of immense wealth, that their endowment was considerable. Were those true?
Well, by 1790, the Albany Shakers had established the first wildly successful garden seed industry, and so they were very adept business people pretty early on. There were a few accounts of people absconding with money and then leaving the Shakers and that. But generally speaking, they were very solid business people. They did invent the first commercial washing machine, and it was patented. They also invented or modified other technology to meet their unique lifestyle. And when you've got 100, 200, 300 people in your family, there's a little wonder that you need a commercial washing machine. So there's a fallacy that they invented the clothespin. I think that's a misinterpretation of the term pin, which in England is the peg rails on the walls, not clothespins as we know them. They did not invent the circular saw, but they invented a type of circular saw. So they did invent the first steel pen nibs. So there's, again, I think a need for much more serious research. We've got research that was done back in the 1940s and 50s when the first Shaker scholars started getting going. There were no Shaker libraries, no Shaker museums at that time, so I think their information was either incomplete or in some cases inaccurate. So we have a long way to go. I think this gentleman back here.
Yes, is it true that the original burial site for Annalee was at the Albany airport, and they moved that site to the Shaker Cemetery when they built the runways?
No, it was done a long time before that. It was done about 1810. Because the Shakers no longer leased that land from the Van Rensselaers. Like everyone else, they were part of this manorial system. They couldn't buy the land. They had to give goods to the Van Rensselaers and money to the Van Rensselaers. It wasn't until I think 1830 that they actually bought some land. But they no longer had access to that. There were several, I think there were 4 graves there. And there's a very graphic account of when they moved the bodies to the current cemetery. And they describe what the bones looked like, how there were, obviously Annalee and her brother had been beaten repeatedly by the description of their bones.
When did Brother Otto become a Shaker?
I think it was in the 1980s. It was before I started studying Shaker, but I believe in the 1980s. And it was controversial, yeah.
I'm curious to know what was the belief, the rationale that the Chapman children were taken. Was it because Mr. Chapman became a Shaker? I mean, how did the Shakers, why would they refuse to give the children back to their mother?
Well, I think the laws of the time, and the Shakers were quite savvy about the legal system and lobbying politicians and that sort of thing, even in that time period. The laws were that the man was in charge of the children. So Eunice's husband had complete legal authority over his children. I think that Lucy Wright thought she was doing the right thing for the children. They were raising a lot of orphans in that time period, and by most accounts, providing a really healthy and good lifestyle and childhood for many, many children. So I think she thought she was doing what was right legally and what was right morally for the children. I think they saw Eunice Chapman as kind of a crazy woman. And I think she must have been a little bit crazy to wage the kind of war that she did, but she also, was a mother, and I can understand why she fought so hard. I think I might have done the same thing, So that's why I say, I love the way that Ilion lays this out in the book, because she doesn't vilify the Shakers or Eunice. They both had their good points and their bad points. Mother Lucy Wright was human too. I think in that case, personally, I think it was the wrong thing to do.
What about the men and women having equal status within the community? That's what sort of baffles me.
Well, they didn't really, though.
Okay, so that's basically was a false.
Yeah, they had a much greater degree of equality than the outside world. But if you look at the fact that, they followed traditional gender roles. Men weren't doing laundry and repairing socks, They were out working in the fields and inventing things and that sort of thing. I think there was always this dance between the Shakers and the outside world, and in some cases they would rebel vigorously against the outside world's conventions. In many cases they followed them.
What kind of decision-making process was there? Was it authoritarian or?
Quite.
Yeah.
Yeah, the elders and eldresses appointing each other. It was not a democratic society by any means.
The Shaker dancing, could you show us?
Well, I actually don't do a lot of the dance myself, but I can show you what, sort of what it's like. They would shuffle like this in formations, bow and bend, and seek spiritual inspiration. And they did it, it wasn't one individual dancing. It was dozens, and they would dance in geometric formations, in circles. So you'd have a line of men, say, in one circle, and then a line of women in the next circle. And they were not supposed to physically touch each other, but they would be, rotate around each other in these formations. It must have been quite a spectacle, because the women wore white dresses with shockingly bright blue shoes, and the men wore blue vests with kind of khaki pants and white shirts. It was quite a display, and it was intended to inspire people to join the faith. But it also was a way to enforce uniformity within the community, and they called it laboring. It was a way of showing their worshiping God and laboring to praise God.
Was there an actual shaking?
Well, that was earlier. That was in Mother Annalee's time period. That largely was gone by the second decade of the 20th century, certainly. You didn't see a lot of that happening. There was a spiritual revival called the Era of Manifestations that happened in the late 1830s and started here, actually, and spread to the other communities, and it led to the famous Shaker gift drawings. Literally thousands of songs were received as spiritual inspiration in that time period. So occasionally it popped up now and then, but it was not really uniformly accepted even within the Shaker community after the 19th century.
Didn't the women back in the 80s, the three sisters that were originally left, I think one was Sister Bertha, set up some type of legal document that people who came in could not get control of the monies and everything like that?
Yeah, she was asking about the Shaker women in she's saying the 1980s, but I think it was the 1960s or 70s, who set up a trust to keep new Shakers from accessing their money. It's kind of a messy story, but in essence what happened was the Shakers who lived at Canterbury, New Hampshire, which is where the lead ministry was situated in the 1960s, decided to close the covenant. They decided they were not going to accept any more Shakers. The Shaker faith was dead, basically. The Shakers who lived at Sabbath Day Lake, Maine, didn't agree. And essentially the Shakers in Maine outlived the Shakers in Canterbury, and they were accepting new people, and now, that's the way it is now. So some people will say that the Shakers in Maine are not true Shakers. There was in the 60s a trust fund set up, and nobody I know, no Shaker scholar that I know of, has actually seen these legal documents. But there may have been some provisions related to that. But yes, they were selling off, communities were closing down. And as they closed down, they were selling huge quantities of land. I mean, the Shakers didn't acquire a lot of material possessions necessarily, but they acquired humongous land holdings. And so they had quite a bit of money in that fund. I know that the Sabbath Day Lake Shakers just recently negotiated a conservation easement on their property so that it will be preserved in perpetuity. I think they're planning ahead, but nobody knows what the financial situation really is. The Shakers in Maine sustain themselves through, they still have some small industries that they're involved in. I think there is a little bit of a trust fund, and they also have a friends group that anybody can join. They have work days if you want to go up there and work to help maintain the community. You can do that, and you can also pay an annual fee to be a member of the Friends Group, which helps sustain the community.
Did they call themselves Shaker, or the name was given by outside people?
The official name is the United Society of Believers in Christ's Second Appearing. Shakers is kind of a derogatory term that was applied to them, but they just adopted it, which I think is kind of characteristic of Shakers.
What's the legal status of the Shaker Meeting House and the other buildings here in this area?
In Albany, Albany County purchased that property in 1925 to use it as a sanitarium for tuberculosis patients, and they built the Annalee nursing home, which Annalee never lived there or saw it. Obviously, it was built in the 1930s. The county still owns the property today. Shaker Heritage Society last November, after several years of lobbying, obtained a 15-year lease for most, not all, of the Shaker buildings and the land in between. You can be assured we will be going back to bat again. We've got one of our board members here will be helping with this, to lobby again, because you have to have at least 15 years to be eligible for capital improvement grants. So the clock is ticking. I'm already not eligible. I was able to get money to repair the roof of the 1916 barn and the roof of the 1856 drying house, but we're going to have to get another new lease so we can be eligible again. So the society is this tiny little organization, but we're quite ambitious and feisty, and we will get a 20-year lease sometime soon, so that we have a little more flexibility to actually raise the money to fix up the buildings. I don't see us taking over ownership anytime soon because we're too small. We don't have enough resources yet, but that may come in the future.
Backing up a little bit with the dancing and the hymns. Was there instrumental accompaniment, or was this all a cappella?
It was all vocal music until the 1870s. All instruments were banned. And there's a great story about I'm forgetting his name now. There was a Shaker brother at Mount Lebanon who invented a piano violin. It's a very strange instrument. It's like a box with strings through it and keys and a violin handle sticking out. He thought he was going to go around Columbia County and teach children how to play music and then inspire them to become Shakers. And the elders didn't like that idea at all. But it really kind of started them thinking about instruments. It really, all the rules started loosening up in the last quarter of the 19th century. So eventually they did allow instruments, and in fact there was a trio of saxophone players at Canterbury Shaker Village, all women Shakers. So they did allow it in after a while, but it wasn't ever a part of their formal worship service. If you go to Albany Pro Musica's website, we just recently had somebody transcribe from the original manuscripts Shaker music that hasn't been performed in a very, very long time. We had Albany Pro Musica perform the music, and we recorded it professionally. We're using it as part of our interpretation of the historic site, but if you go to their website, you can hear the music being performed by Albany Pro Musica. Well, thank you all. I do hope that you'll check out the Shaker Heritage Society and come back for the other components of this program.